The only thing that's in my hands, and not in anyone else's hands, is the original ratzon. My will. Everything else is not in my hands. Am I going to be able to find a good end?
Welcome to Prism of Torah with Rebbe Saf Aaron Prisman, engaging Divrei Torah, packed with stories and practical insights. Find us wherever you get your podcasts or at prismoftorah.org.
Shalom Avocha. This week's Parshas Emor, one of the mitzvahs that we're living every day that's in the Parsha is Sefiras HaOmer, the counting of the Omer that we all know. We count 7 weeks from Pesach till Shavuos. Now, when do we start counting? The second day of Pesach. Why the second day of Pesach? Because there was a sacrifice, a very important sacrifice called Korban Omer, which consisted of bringing a sacrifice of barley from the new produce. Now, from that point onwards, one is allowed to eat all the new wheat, all the new produce that comes from the field. But before that, there's a big Isur called Isur Chadash. It's new, you can't have it until we bring this sacrifice. And hence, we start counting until Shavuos, and we call it Sefiras HaOmer based on the starting point, which is the sacrifice we bring, Korban Omer. This leads to several questions. Some are popular, some less. Question number 1, why are we calling the sacrifice HaOmer, Korban Omer, the sacrifice of the Omer? Shouldn't it be more about what the sacrifice represents? The fact that we can start eating from the new produce at that point, or maybe it should be what the essence of the sacrifice is. Instead, we're calling it Omer. Omer is a volume. It's like saying the sacrifice of the leader. L'choira, that needs explanation. Question number 2, why is the counting towards Shavuos called Sefiras HaOmer? We're counting till the sacrifice. That was a starting point. We're counting towards something. It should be towards Shavuos. The counting towards Shavuos. And why are we counting up, Bichla? When you look forward to something, you should count down. And last but not least question is, there's a famous midrash. The midrash says that, this Korban Omer, this sacrifice was unbelievable. It had such unbelievable effects on Klal Yisrael. Avram Avinu merited to get Eretz Yisrael because of that. HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings peace between a husband and wife thanks to this sacrifice. It sounds like this sacrifice has something very powerful. What is so unique about this? To answer all these questions, I want to bring down an unbelievable vote I saw Hashem Rav Yosef Misalant in the Sefer Be'er Yosef. And he asked the question, how can you call the sacrifice based on the volume, Korban Omer? That doesn't make so much sense. And to that he answers an unbelievable idea. This volume, Omer, is found in one other place. And that is when the man fell, when Bnei Yisrael were in the desert for 40 years, and the man came down, then that man was a huge miracle, that it could taste like whatever you want to, and it was obvious it was coming from Hashem, it came from the sky. And how much was a person allowed to take of that? Omer la gulgolis, which means per person, 1 liter worth of this man. Says the Be'er Yosef, during those times when they were in the desert, when they left Egypt until they came into Eretz Yisrael, they always had this man. That means that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it was evident to everyone that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is running the world. We're doing nothing. Hashem's protecting us. There was Amud Anan, Amud Esh. There was a lot of miracles that happened during that time, and hence it was very tangible and evident that Ein Oid Milvadoy, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. However, the original plan was that we get the Heilige Torah, which is what life is all about, which is Shavuos, and then with that Torah, we go into Eretz Yisrael, and that's where we're meant to live, and we live with the Torah together. Of course, there was Chet HaMeraglim, and hence we had to be in the desert for longer. Now, this man that came down stopped in Zayin Adar, which was when Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, and still the leftover man lasted for them until they came into Eretz Yisrael. Once they entered into Eretz Yisrael, the whole Mahalach, the whole Hanhaga was different. Instead of being evident that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was running the world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted us to work the field, the land, and hence we get food through our own work. And hence, over here, there's a big test for us, because a person can easily fall to his Yetzer Hara and say, oh, it's because I worked really hard. Look how well I planted the trees. Look how well I watered them. It's because of me I'm having good food. And it's not true. Hashem wants you to do that. But despite the fact that that is what you need to do, at the end of the day, everything's coming from Hashem. And you need to remember that. Ad kedei kach, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu ensured that they take the last man and put it in some sort of a jar to remind everyone, you know what this is? This is when we're in the desert. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us food from the sky. Everyone should remember that. Says the Be'er Yosef, it's the same idea over here. Why are we calling it Sefiras HaOmer? Because the ideal plan was for us to get the Torah and to go into Eretz Yisrael. Once we do that, there's a danger. We're not going to realize that everything's coming from Hashem. It's less tangible. To be a constant reminder to that, we're calling the days that we count Sefiras HaOmer to remind ourselves. Omer is the same volume that was in the man. It's kind of like a link to remember that everything's coming from Hashem just like the man was. And there was a lot of miracles involved in the man. We didn't have to go to the washroom. It tasted like anything we wanted. And it was evident it came from Hashem. So too now, everything is about that. Everything's coming from Hashem. And that is the reason we call the Korban the Omer. Mimele, I want to kick it up a notch and say, and add to this another idea. I heard from one of my Rebbeim, Rav Kornfeld Shlita, in the name of Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, that he said, in anything we do, we should know there's three parts of what we do. When we decide to do something, there's our will to do something. Even if it's a mitzvah, there's our will, our ratzon. Then there's the actual action we have to do. And then there's the result that we're anticipating and we hope that will happen. For example, I want to get a very mehudar esrog. So that's my will. Then I have to do the act of purchasing and finding a good esrog. And then I need the result of the mitzvah, which is to actually shake the lulav and esrog and get the mitzvah. The only thing that's in my hands, and not in anyone else's hands, is the original ratzon, my will. Everything else is not in my hands. Am I going to be able to find a good esrog? Is it going to fall and the pitum's going to break? Or what's going to happen? That's not in my hands. Am I going to be able to physically be able to do the mitzvah? It's also not in my hands. So the only thing that's in my hands is my will. Perhaps, to answer the other questions we raised, also in Sefiras HaOmer, it's screaming out this idea. You should know everything's coming from Hashem, just like the man came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The only thing that's in our hands is our will, which is the initial starting point. The initial starting point of Sefiras HaOmer was the original sacrifice, and that we want to count towards Shavuos. So it's not about counting down to getting to the result. The result, if we're going to get the Torah, even though we want it, that's not in our hands. In fact, we see we didn't enter into Eretz Yisrael straight away. There was a sin involved. It's all in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands. If we're going to be able to put into fruition what we want and get the result we're anticipating and we hope to have. But everything is in Hashem's hands except for one thing, the Ratzon, the will to do Ratzon Hashem, and that is the Bchira Chofshit, the freedom of choice that we have that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is putting in our hands, and Schar and Onesh, punishment reward, is all based on that. And hence we answer all our questions, because that's why the sphere is called Sefiras HaOmer, because it's reminding ourselves the starting point's what's important, because that's our will to do Ratzon Hashem, to count towards Shavuos, which we know how important the Torah is. Why are we not counting down? Because we're perhaps wanting to reiterate this idea that everything's based on the beginning. That's our will. And yes, every day we're working on ourselves as much as we can. That's why there's 48 ways to acquire the Torah. We're working ourselves, we do our best. But at the end of the day, it's in Hashem's hands. That's also what's so amazing about this Korban Omer, because it represents, based on what we said, the idea of emunah. And we know Bach Habakuk in the Gemara in Makos towards the end, and said all the mitzvahs can be summarized in one idea, having true, unimpacted emunah and bitachon in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the main core of all the mitzvahs. They all have emunah in Hashem, that we know no matter what happens to us, no matter how difficult life can be, and it can be pretty difficult at different points in time, we have to remember it's all coming from Hashem, it's for the best. That's true emunah. I want to end off with something that happened over here in Eretz Yisrael, literally a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure everyone has heard about it. It was in Iyar Tafshin Pei, May 7th, May 8th, 2025, when there were crazy fires in Eretz Yisrael, and it was a crazy combination of a very dry, hot climate together with crazy winds, and hence the fires were going across the hills of Yerushalayim, and the scene looked pretty crazy. It looked totally out of hand. The sky was literally orange. No matter where you lived, you could smell it in the air. The most critical highways were closed, like Kvish Mispar Echad, Route 1. Ad kedei kach that cars were literally abandoned on the streets. More than 120 firefighting teams were there. Air tankers, helicopters, everything. In fact, they begged communities for help. And there were many communities over here that were evacuated, such as some of my neighborhood, Beit Shemesh, Neve Shalom also, and others. Yet, there was something that I just realized as my daughter sent me a certain email with a picture and someone speaking, and I also heard it on the I have a special number that I listen to, filtered news that doesn't have Lashon Hara in it. And they said that despite the crazy devastations, in the heart of all of this, there's something very unexpected that was seen, something that almost defies logic. There was a patch of farmland that was still green, and it was so evident, and maybe I'll send everyone the picture. It was in the middle of a landscape that everything around it was totally burnt, but in the middle there was green. Ad kedei kach that a drone operator, you can hear his voice crack with disbelief as he said, I can't believe it. And I'm translating from Hebrew. He said, I flew my drone over here. Look at this. Every surrounding field belongs to farmers who are not observing the mitzvah of Shemitah. And you could see all their fields in that area at least turned to ash. But there were some certain plots that stayed green. And he said it's from a moshav, an area called Matityahu, next to, not far from Modi'in, where they kept Shemitah. I think some of those fields I heard were esrog fields. There were some trees that were burnt on the edges, but at the end of the day, it almost didn't make sense. And I heard the person that witnessed this that said you could see the fire did a U-turn to get out of that field. It was unbelievable. Another witness said, I'm driving back surrounded by totally, you could see everything's black, left, right, front, back. And then in the middle of all this, he saw a huge green gap. And of course, there was a sign there still from the days of Shemitah, here we observe Shemitah. And it shook many people. So why am I saying this idea? Because the Torah actually tells us the person that keeps Shemitah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will protect their land and ensure there is abundance. What I want to say is that we have to have this belief that all the mitzvahs and everything Hashem tells us to do, that is what guides the spiritual DNA and physical DNA of the world. Yiratzon, that we'll be able to take this idea of the Omer, brought down by the Be'er Yosef, and live up to the core of all Yiddishkeit, which is the mitzvah of emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictates the spiritual and physical DNA of the world, and it's all based on the Torah and mitzvahs. And that's what we're going to celebrate, Mitzvah Hashem, and that's what we're counting towards the Heilige Day of Shavuos. Have a good Shabbos.
This concludes another episode of the Prism of Torah. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something valuable. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast and give a 5-star rating. You can also find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts or our own website, prismoftorah.com, where we have a full archive of all our past episodes. We would like to thank Yona Vefa for the recording equipment and Eli Podcast Productions for handling all our post-podcast productions. Join us next week for another enlightening conversation on the Prism of Torah.